So my name is Annie Contractor. I am an independent consultant and I work on economic and community development and participatory governance. And I've been working with Rural Assembly to offer a few different webinars this year. This is the second of 4 webinars that are planned. And during the first session, we talked a lot about AI data centers. And a theme really emerged from that first session, which was around how rural communities can claim agency when they're facing big outside pressures. That was a really looming thing for folks who are either facing AI data centers coming to their communities or thought that they might come in the future. And we thought a lot about what are the tools that rural communities might have available to them if they know a big development pressure is coming or they suspect one might come in the near future. So today I wanted to deep dive into a live example of how one community claimed some agency in their community against a development pressure through a specific tool called a community benefits agreement. So just a little bit of stage setting here around community benefits agreements, which are often called CBAs. This is a kind of agreement that can take a lot of different forms, but the key to them is that they're a contract. There's an entity that's composed of community members, and they hold the ability to formally enter a contract. And they come together to negotiate with the developing entity to get something specific for the community out of that development or that big change pressure. So why did we want to talk about community benefits agreements and why do we want to talk about them right now? These are a really clear and concrete tool for how communities can grab a hold of power in concrete situations. The CBA is a process. It's an act of claiming agency through the process of mapping who needs what and from whom. And when the negotiation window opens, trying to figure out those details by bringing community expertise to the table. When we decided to focus on community benefits agreements, I immediately thought of Jackson. I had met Jackson a few years ago at a National Academies event where we were brought together to specifically talk about community benefits agreements. Jackson is faculty at Montana State University and managed a grassroots organization in central Montana where he led negotiation of a CBA that's tied to the Black Butte Copper Project. Today, he's here to show us how this community figured this out. We're not going to do an overview of CBAs. There's a lot of content out there that does that, lots of recorded sessions. But what I have asked Jackson to do is drill down to just how did you get it to work? How did we start from people who had concerns about something they were hearing about in their community to claiming that agency and feeling like there was some level of balance in the power? We're hoping that this gives you all here an opportunity to think about how it might look in your community and what some really concrete steps could be if this is something that feels like a good fit in your community in a rural place. So without further ado, welcome, Jackson. Thank you for being here and thank you for being willing to share your story. I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Annie. And thank you, Tainum and the whole Rural Assembly team. Really excited to be here today and talk to you about Marr County in Montana. So I'm going to share my screen and get some slides going. Okay, so yes, like I said, very excited to talk to you all about, as Annie kind of laid out there, what happened in Marr County, Montana, specifically around it's an industrial project, so it's not a data center, but I do think there are real tangible lessons learned that you can hopefully take back to your communities and understanding that these things happen rooted in place, right? So very glad that we don't have to get into too far into the technical weeds on what a CBA is. Sounds like you all already have some context there in a previous webinar in addition to what Annie laid out. So I'm just going to dive right in. I'm guessing that most of you don't know where Marr County is, even if you're somewhat familiar with Montana's geography. So we'll spend a little bit of time just talking about the context of that specific place. And then I'll kind of move into how this conversation about a CBA, a community benefits agreement, emerged, how it evolved, and then spend a big chunk of the time on lessons learned and takeaways, again, so that hopefully you leave this webinar saying, okay, maybe there's not a data center being proposed in your community, but they're popping up all over the place. There's a lot in Montana proposed right now. So maybe there's another project where you can take some of these practices and have conversations with the folks in your community. So that's kind of what we'll talk about. I also want to leave plenty of time for questions. We have until top of the hour. It's a long time to sit and listen to one person talk. So I'm going to carve out at least 15 minutes to have some dialogue, because I know we have a lot of folks in our virtual room here. So that's kind of the plan. So we'll just jump right in. So I said Marr County. This work and this story is really rooted in White Sulphur Springs, which if we were in a real room right now, I would be asking you all to raise your hands if you've heard of White Sulphur Springs or if you've been to White Sulphur Springs. I'm guessing it'd be a very small minority. So White Sulphur Springs is a extremely small town in central Montana. I've got a map here for us. So you can see on the Montana context map on the top right there, Marr County is highlighted. White Sulphur Springs is in essentially the center of Marr County, which you might be able to see labeled there on the larger kind of main map. So this is a very remote rural area. There's about 2,000 people on the entire county, and White Sulphur Springs has about 1,000 of those. So you may have heard this famous saying about Montana having more cows than people. I don't think that's true any longer, but it's definitely true for Marr County. So very remote, very isolated, a mix of, if you can kind of see in that first photo, mountains with grasslands and plains. So very kind of rugged terrain, and about 2 hours from any sort of large metropolitan area. So Bozeman, Helena, both about 2 hours drive. So there's a sign, which I wish I had a picture of for this presentation, on the local cafe in White Sulphur. There's a sign which says McDonald's 100 miles that way. So small town vibes. And just to give you a little bit of context in terms of the demographics, this is a community that's been not necessarily in decline, but very stagnant. So looking at census data going back to 2010, they've actually lost residents since 2010, whereas Montana as a whole has been really booming during that time in terms of population growth, one of the highest growth states in the country. The median age in Marr County is 57, and by comparison in Montana, it's 40. So it's not only a small community, but it's an aging community. Historically, White Sulphur Springs was a timber town. So they had 2 local sawmills that were big in terms of local employment. Those both closed in the 80s, and that's really what started this kind of like stagnation decline. The current economy relies pretty heavily on agriculture. There is a lot of public sector jobs because there's a lot of public land in the county. And then they do have a pretty strong recreation economy. So there's a very famous river called the Smith River that runs through Marr County. It's so popular that you actually have to put in for a lottery system in order to float it in the summer. So it's a very popular, just for both just joy floating, if you will, just for fun, but also for trout fishing. And then there's hunting opportunities, there's skiing, and because of that abundance of public lands, other types of recreation are pretty strong economic drivers in today's economy. So that's me talking about the community a little bit. I do have a very short video. It's just 2 minutes and 30 seconds, which is actually the trailer for a documentary that was made recently about White Sulphur, which I think will really give you a sense of the feel of the place. So if we can play that, that would be awesome.
You know, White Sulphur Springs hasn't changed a whole lot since the early 70s when I first came through town. It still has less than 1,000 residents, many of whom are ranching families, and of course, it's still in the middle of some of the most beautiful country anywhere. But whether we like it or not, this community is going to change, assuming the Black Butte Copper Mine does move forward, which it looks like it probably will. The idea behind starting the Marr County Stewardship Council with some assistance from the mine was to bring a group of people together, mostly local leaders and some folks from neighboring towns who come from varying perspectives. The council leaders share two common desires. One, to help guide White Sulphur and Marr County toward a vibrant, healthy, and sustainable future. And two, to do it through collaboration. In the past, neighbors around here might not have agreed about an issue, but they could understand each other's perspective and would be willing to have a little give and take, eventually agreeing upon what was best for everyone. We need to help White Sulphur and rural towns like it find a way to protect what they have, both culturally and environmentally, without being left behind or becoming just another boom and bust community. With the council's leadership, White Sulphur is already reimagining rural. And whether for the annual music festival, rodeo, floating the Smith, or to check out one of the new businesses in town, I find myself coming back to what is still one of my very favorite communities in the West. Let's face it, one way or the other, change is coming to this can-do rural community. So the question really is, what will White Sulphur be 40, 50 years from now?
Thanks, Tatum. So, again, hopefully that kind of gave you a sense of the feel of the place. That's a trailer for a full feature length. Well, I say feature length. I don't know what feature length actually is. About a 25-minute documentary that was produced in the last couple of years, which I'm happy to share a link to that in materials that go out after the meeting. So you heard the narrator there. Bill Bryan is his name. He posed kind of that question at the end, right? Like, what is White Sulphur going to look like in 40, 50 years? Change is coming for the community. And I think that's really kind of that orienting principle, why we're all here gathered to talk about CBAs and things that bring significant disruption, like a data center, in this case, a mine, to a local community. So that gets us to that project that he mentioned, that mine that he mentioned in the video. So a little context on this. This is a underground mining project, copper mining, in just about 20 miles north of White Sulphur Springs. It originally was, the exploration goes way back into the 80s for copper in this area, but the current permitting began in the early 2010s. Oh, did I lose the slides? I'm so sorry. Thank you, Dominic. There we go. They're back. So the copper mine, the permitting process started in 2013. Right away, it was a very controversial project because of some of these things that I've already mentioned. So the Smith River, very prized and beloved trout, Blue River trout fishing stream that runs through the county. Water quality is paramount. And so this project, when it was proposed, drew a lot of pushback, especially from conservation environmental groups that were worried about water quality specifically. It is a very, very high grade deposit. And I just say that to point out that the economic incentive is real to develop that. And so it has just recently, in the last couple of years, made it through the permitting process. So they do have an operating permit and are free to go ahead and develop the mine. They have not proceeded with that beyond just initial kind of earthworks construction. So there's no buildings. It's going to be an underground project, and they haven't built a tunnel, things like that. So we'll get to why that might be in a little bit. But just to give you a little bit of context, another map there just showing this is actually a map that the mining company put together. And I kind of wanted to point out that they say strong local and regional community support. So like I said, it was fairly controversial, but mixed opinions, right? So you saw in that trailer that there are folks coming together to chat about the project that some might be more skeptical, some more supportive. So again, this isn't a data center, but it's really important when a project of this scale, right? This is an industrial scale proposal. When it comes into a rural community, one of the initial conversations that happen are often around the pros and cons, right? This is a balancing act. So just to point some of those out. So the opportunities. So this is, I mentioned that this is a community that hasn't seen real population growth or economic growth in quite some time. So this mine really offered both White Sulphur and Marr County an economic opportunity. This would bring upwards of 200 full-time jobs with an average salary. These average salary numbers have probably changed in the last few years, but the mine a few years ago was projecting about 70,000. The median wage paying job in Marr County is closer to 50, so significantly higher. A really big increase to the tax base, right? So both for the county and for the municipality of White Sulphur Springs, this is going to allow them to make infrastructure upgrades and improve their schools, those kind of things. And then there are these kind of secondary spillover economic effects, right? There are going to be businesses that pop up to support the mine. You can imagine someone maybe starting a semi-truck repair shop, right, to service mining trucks. Of course, the miners ideally are going to be shopping at local stores. The mine might be procuring supplies from local vendors, things of that nature, right? So definitely a real opportunity on the economic side of things, but there are, of course, on the other side of that coin, there are real risks to a project like this. So Montana has a very, I think checkered would be a generous way to say it, a very checkered history with mining. We have one of the largest Superfund sites in the nation, just a few hours away from this, tied to copper mining in Butte, and a lot of legacy impacts from mining, not only to the environment, but to communities, right? That video mentioned in the trailer, that boom bust cycle, we all understand that phenomenon, right? So, but other kind of risks and potential impacts with a community of 900 people, 200 jobs sounds great, but if you get 300 people that move in, that's going to be a real kind of disruption to your way of life potentially, right? This is kind of a rural, slow pace to life. So an influx of new residents can definitely be disruptive. Also thinking beyond the project, right? So with a potentially short-term mine, that question of 20, 30 years down the road, are you going to be better off, right? There's three possibilities. You could be kind of in the same place, right? You could be worse off, or you could be better off. But thinking about those kind of long-term legacy impacts, that was really the motivating conversation. And that was happening over the last 10 to 15 years in Marr County and in White Sulphur Springs as this mine proposal was making its way through the permitting process. And so what kind of happened there in response to those questions? So a group came together, a stakeholder group called the Marr County Stewardship Council. So originally this was a just informal, there was no regular meeting schedule. It was just people getting together, at the community center, using, meeting at the high school, and just having these conversations. And eventually that transitioned into a 501c3. So the Marr County Stewardship Council, which got its 501c3 status in 2019, is a group that specifically came together in response to the mine. And from the get-go, they were not taking a stance. So they weren't coming out and saying, we support this project or we're opposed to this project. Rather, they wanted to basically make a vehicle for community agency, right? And they said, okay, if this does move forward, we want to make sure that this is going to result in those long-term tangible benefits for our community, for our residents. So they wanted to work closely with the mine, and they really made an effort to gather a group of folks that, like I mentioned before, had diverse perspectives. So the local community was fairly supportive of the project, I'd say. You know, I don't have polling numbers or anything, but you drive around White Sulphur, and even going back to 2010, you'd see signs saying, "We support the Black Butte Copper Project." So a lot of local support, but there were folks in the area who were skeptical. I'll give you just a couple examples. So I mentioned the recreation opportunities. There's a woman who owns a local ski hill just north of White Sulphur Springs. So that's a person who, you know, makes a living using public land and these recreational opportunities for both residents and tourists. So that was someone that was skeptical, that was on the council from the early days. Even folks that you might think would be supportive. If you own a local business, it sounds great, like I mentioned, but think through how the challenge presented. If a mine comes in and you're paying an hourly worker to work at the coffee shop $12 to $15, if they can go work at the mine and make $25 an hour, you can see how that might be challenging to keep that person in their position. So there were folks that kind of came to the table with some concerns. So this group came together and started exploring options in terms of what tools were out there, what pathways could they look to make sure this was a net long-term benefit for the community. And so I was involved from the early days here, and we were looking high and low for options here. And we found kind of inspiration from some community developer agreements, both like super close to home. So this little snapshot that I have in the slide here is the front page of the Good Neighbor Agreement, which is a legal contract tied to some other mines in Southwest Montana. Not a true community benefits agreement. It's more of an impact mitigation agreement, but it does things like protect water quality. It stipulates where the mine can and can't build employee housing to try to avoid, in this case, temporary housing camps that are disruptive to rural communities. And it has a number of other provisions, but it was signed, if you can see potentially at the bottom of that screenshot, in 2000. So they just celebrated their 25th anniversary in 2025. And Israeli, this agreement has kind of been held up as the gold standard in terms of a legal contract between community groups and a developer, in this case, again, a mining company. So we saw that and we said, hey, here's a framework, here's a structure we can probably draw upon. Even if the exact provisions and the priorities aren't the same, this is that legal, like I said, it's a framework that we can potentially pull from. And then we also looked internationally and found examples of community benefits agreements tied to mines in Australia and Canada. So lots of examples there. Didn't really find any other examples of CBA specifically in the United States. So this was kind of a novel effort, right? We were kind of building the plane as we flew it here a little bit. But like I said, kind of drawing inspiration from similar agreements. So what the high level kind of process, let me just like walk you through how we approach this. So the first thing that we knew was, yeah, a CBA might be a great tool, but like what goes in it, right? Like what's the meat of the agreement? And to answer that question, we knew we had to get perspectives from stakeholder groups across the entire community. So we embarked on an effort that lasted almost 3 years to convene a series of focus groups. And we did a big town hall, which you can see in that picture on the slide on the left. And so we tried to hear from as many folks as we could. So everyone from that guide that is fly fishing guide that takes folks down the Smith River and makes a living that way, to that coffee shop owner that I mentioned, to the CEO of the hospital, to the mayor. We tried to ask everybody, you know, what are your priorities? What are your concerns with this project coming in? And how might we address those if we're going to work with the mine to come up with some sort of formal agreement? So we did all those focus groups at town hall. One of the really cool initiatives that we did or components of that town hall was we actually flew in folks from other communities across the West that had hosted mines and asked them, if you could go back 25 years or however long since the mine started, what would you do differently, right? Because sometimes that hindsight is really, really valuable. So that's what happened there. From that point, we had a list, right? We had a list of kind of a wish list, if you will, but also a list of, like I mentioned, concerns and areas that we wanted to make sure there was accountability and protection in place for the community. So we sat down and came up with a framework for a community benefits agreement. And meanwhile, the mine is involved kind of every step of the way here. So they're attending meetings for the Marr County Stewardship Council. So they are kind of at the table watching this kind of agreement unfold, right? And there's a back and forth process happening there. And then once that was in place, that's when the negotiations actually started. So you can say that maybe informal negotiations were happening sort of along the way throughout those conversations. But the formal side of the negotiations didn't really kickstart until that framework was established and in place. So I won't spend a ton of time on the specific initiatives of this agreement because, again, I want to make this broadly applicable for you all taking back to your community, but just so you know what we negotiated and advocated for. So we asked for direct investment in the community in things like education and especially youth education, right? This is a rural place where options for childcare and pre-K and things like that are underfunded and limited and make it hard for working families. So we asked for specific investments into those kind of programs. Housing, right? Housing, you have to realize this is in the middle of COVID-related impacts to the housing market in Montana, and those even hit small towns like White Sulphur. So the housing supply was scarce, and in White Sulphur specifically, the housing stock was in pretty poor condition. So we talked about ways to address that. Also thinking about, when that big construction boom happens, like how are we going to handle 200, 300 construction workers coming in, even if it's for a short time? That's going to potentially drive up rent prices. That's going to, fill up Airbnbs and VRBOs and short-term options for folks. That's going to impact the tourist and recreation economy. So we had those kind of conversations. And then we negotiated specifically for I've mentioned the long term several times now, for a fund, an investment into the community that was going to last beyond the life of the mine. So something that the community could have at the end of the day, that they could continue to invest in priorities that are shifting over time long after the mine had wrapped up and left town. On the environmental side, we negotiated for protections and accountability that went above and beyond state regulations tied to things like water quality and other environmental monitoring, thinking about things like noxious weeds, and then getting back to that kind of rural way of life, asking the mine to put in specific provisions into their employee handbooks and orientations to respect current land use and recreational practices. So you can imagine, like I said, if you live in a rural community and you go up to, the lake on the weekends, and if a mine comes in and, there's a mine employee that's, using that as like sort of temporary housing in an RV or something, that could be a source of conflict. So we talked about educating new folks coming to town and mine employees on both the kind of best practices, but also just respecting regulations and things like that around public land access and use. And then finally, and I think most important for this group, this agreement included a lot of accountability mechanisms, right? So it was designed to set up that formal framework for the community, in this case, the Stewardship Council, to negotiate and work with the mine on an ongoing basis, knowing that priorities are going to change, questions are going to come up. So it, has annual work plans that both sides agree to jointly work on each year. things like dispute resolution, right? So what if one side is not holding up their end of the bargain? What does that look like? Obviously, that gets into the legal realm and contract language and things of that nature. But then one of the big ones, mines change hands all the time. So they sell frequently to larger companies. And one of the early priorities was designing an agreement that could survive any potential ownership transitions, so that it didn't get discarded in the event that the mine was acquired by a larger company. So that was a lot of context. I think now we're getting to the real meat of the discussion, and things that I hope are very beneficial and insightful for you all. So some of the stuff that worked and some stuff that maybe didn't work or was just hard to pull off. So what really worked was kind of like building that coalition and starting those conversations, and setting up that framework, like I mentioned, before the negotiations happened with a mine. So before there was ever like lawyers involved, for example, before contract language was ever brought up, we were building those coalitions and having those conversations across the community. Eventually, the Stewardship Council did retain independent legal counsel. So that was super, super important. The funding for that is something that we can talk about in Q&A. That's often a challenge communities face, is like, where do we get the funds to hire a lawyer to come help us with these kind of things? But in this case, the council was able to get their own lawyer that had experience working with natural resource companies and developers. So that was a huge bonus. And then in terms of like the specifics, like making the asks very, very specific, right? Thinking even before the negotiations had started, like, how are we going to craft this into something that doesn't say like, we'll do our best, or, try to cut out as much of that kind of soft language and get real commitments on funding amounts, on program durations, those kind of things. So that's what worked well. What didn't work well? So I mentioned that the Stewardship Council did get a lawyer. There were still capacity gaps, right? So this is a group of folks who are all wearing about 7 hats. So, someone that's serving on the Stewardship Council, they're obviously a volunteer. They're also running 2 small businesses, right? They have kids in school. And so they have limited capacity just in terms of their time. Whereas, the mine has full-time employees that are, at the table, that are working on this, that are obviously getting paid. So there's just a capacity mismatch. And then, of course, on the technical side of things, understanding how these projects unfold, there's potentially a gap there, right? And then I mentioned, that kind of internal coalition building. These negotiations, it took 7 years to get to a final agreement. I'll get to the final agreement here in a minute. So kind of holding everyone together throughout that entire process was pretty challenging, right? So you can imagine folks are coming onto the Stewardship Council, they're serving 3-year terms. So there were multiple, there was like a whole cohort that served on the council and never got to see kind of the end result. So like bringing new faces into the room, and, those focus groups and that town hall that we held, 5 years ago, it's like making sure everyone is still, on board with like the priorities that had been established. And COVID happens, right? And making sure like things are shifting in real time. So that was a real challenge. The kind of information asymmetry. So I mentioned that the mine's a little bit stalled in their plans, but just to give you a sense of like the corporate structure. So this is a company that is ultimately controlled by a board of directors in Australia. So this is a United States company, but it's majority owned by an Australian company. So there's a lot of there's just a lot of fog in terms of like what's happening, what's coming down the road, what the next decision point is for this company. Like, are they going to move forward? Are they not? Are they going to hire, a local construction company to help? All those kind of things. There's just a lot of, I wouldn't say misinformation, but there's just different levels of information that are available to the two sides here. And then the leverage around negotiations. So that window to really apply leverage from the community side of things is fairly limited, and it's closely tied to the permitting timeline, right? So that's going to look very different for a mine than it is for a data center. But the mine, or the developers coming to the table, understanding that getting what we call a social license in kind of the academic literature, getting that buy-in from the local community, it's super important to them. It becomes a lot less important once they have a permit in hand. So that kind of leverage situation is in flux. And there's a limited opportunity there for the community to exercise their leverage in the negotiations. So some things worked, some didn't. Ultimately, we did get an agreement signed. So I'll also ask Tanem to include a link to this, maybe in some follow-up materials for folks. If you want to look at the full agreement, you can download it. It's on the Marr County Stewardship Council website. There was also a press release. So this actually just came out recently. So like I mentioned, that town hall was held in 2019, and this agreement, this is actually just an MOU. So it's a precursor to the full legal agreement. This was just signed a few months ago. So like I mentioned, it took almost 7 years of these conversations before there was anything that was public, where the mine was advertising that they had agreed to this MOU for the full CBA. So I won't spend any more time on that because I think I've already talked about some of what's in there. This is actually where I'm going to spend the last few minutes here, kind of park it, and I want to walk through like the lessons that we learned, and I hope this will spark a lot of good conversation. Like I said, I'm going to try to wrap up in the next 5 minutes, so we have plenty of time for Q&A. So 5 lessons learned. This is just from my perspective, sitting through these negotiations. So the first one is, like, getting organized as early as possible is super, super important, right? So like I mentioned, the leverage and that's very closely tied to how the project plays out in terms of what permits they need, all that kind of thing. But the earlier that you can get organized and get folks in the room and sit down with a developer, the better, right? So it's never too early, I'd say. The second one, define the community, right? I'm a geographer, so I think about this a lot. But like, who is a stakeholder in this project, right? That looks very different place to place, right? Sometimes this is going to involve indigenous communities if there's tribal lands nearby, right? Sometimes there are, I mentioned public lands in Marr County, so that's a whole group of folks, recreational users, that have a stake in that really care about public lands. But it's going to look different. But figuring out who needs a seat at the table and who should be able to weigh in early on, and trying to be as inclusive as possible in that, right? So I mentioned asking folks that are both skeptical and maybe both are more supportive of a project. It's really important to have both those voices. So just to give you something tangible that the Stewardship Council did in this regard, when they were setting up the 501c3, they wrote into the bylaws that 60% of the board members would be from the county, and they said their goal was to always have at least 40% from outside the county. So that's pretty radical, I think, for a rural small town to say we actually want outsiders that don't live in Marr County to come sit on this nonprofit and to weigh in, because we know that this mine has impacts that could potentially extend well beyond our small community. So get help where you need it. So I mentioned the mine was able to hire a lawyer, but bringing in outside experts that understand that permitting process that I mentioned, right? Some of that might be totally foreign to community members. Like, okay, so they need this permit. Like, what does that involve? Is there public hearings, right? So find experts, and there are legal resources, there are guidebooks, there are toolkits. There's a lot of really good material out there and folks that you can bring in to help the community understand some of these projects, because understanding how they unfold, what those decision points are for the developer is super, super important. So specifics are your friend, right? Like I mentioned, from my experience, I've worked with in these negotiations, and I've done this in a couple other communities across the West. Developers really love soft language, right? They really love the best effort and good faith kind of stuff, which is all great. You want to be neighbors, you want to work together, but at the end of the day, you want something that allows you to hold someone's feet to the fire, per se, right? And so specific, tangible agreements and initiatives that include, all the good things that we all know, SMART goals, make sure they're measurable, they're actionable, they're defined. Those are all going to be really crucial to making sure that if you're looking at a CBA, you craft something that has some teeth. And then finally, like I said, leveraging that project development timeline. I was going to put permitting timeline, but I actually changed that to development timeline because I think it's more than just permit. So I mentioned that leverage might potentially decline once like an operating permit, maybe a land use agreement's in place, but there are other kind of leverage points and inflection points that I think are important here. Again, it's going to be project specific, but in this case, for example, so they have their permits in hand. I mentioned that it's kind of in this murky situation where they haven't moved forward. In this case, that's because they're trying to raise money to build the projects. They need about 300 million. So this is another, point in the project development timeline where they, don't have that money in hand, and therefore that is, that's halting the project, and having a sense of what that looks like from the developer side of things is important for the community, because otherwise, if you're making planning decisions, for example, as a community around these projects, and you don't understand like what that process looks like. Okay, they have the permits. Well, now they actually need to find an investor. That might also mean that they're looking to sell the project, for example. So there are other points beyond just when they need to acquire the necessary permits to build the project that I think are important to leverage from the community side of things. So how'd I do? 10:45, perfect. So like I said, I left 15 minutes. I hope that's probably not enough, but I left this time for questions. So Tam, I don't know if you want to allow folks to raise their hands or how we want to facilitate this. But
we've been tracking and rearranging some questions, and Annie's going to help us facilitate this part. So we'll get right into it. Annie?
Great.
Uncanny how you managed that time so to a T. Well done. Well done. We have so many questions, and we're probably not going to get to all of them. And thank you to the Radically Rural and Rural Assembly teams for organizing those into some clumps so that hopefully we can get to as much as possible. The first clump is around how the community group is organized and the structure and process around CBAs. So I'm going to try to group them as much as I can. The first couple are, what are the benefits of becoming a 501c3, and what were the management structure and leadership process? Couple those together and see if we can hammer a few out with that.
Yes. The benefits to a 501c3. Well, one of the big benefits is that you can receive donations, right? You can receive philanthropic dollars. So in addition, I think it also, like I've used the word framework like several times, right? It sets up that structure where you have, bylaws, a board of directors, and it just adds some legitimacy, right? If you're a small community and you're organizing some folks to go chat with a developer, if you have an actual organization and a status, that doesn't necessarily level the playing field, but I do think it helps, right? And then, like I said, you can recruit support from other folks that might be see your mission and understand what your goals are. So, and then what was the second one, Annie?
The second one is the structure of the leadership in the community group. What was that structure?
Okay, yeah. So like I mentioned, the goal was 60% of the board of directors would be local, understanding the local voice was important, and then 40% would be outside. And who ended up serving on it was like community leaders. So The first chair of the board was actually the CEO of the rural hospital there. There's a very popular music festival there called Red Ants Pants that happens every summer in White Sulphur Springs. The founder of Red Ants Pants, Sarah Calhoun, was vice chair for a long time. She's still on the board. Local business owners. So yeah, folks that are serving in other leadership capacities in White Sulphur Springs were on the board. Local government folks. So that's kind of what that looked like.
And I just want to take an editorial privilege and add one thing to the value of having a 501c3. In these kinds of agreements, you need someone to be able to sign a contract with the developer. So if it's just an informal group of citizens, that can be powerful, but at the end of the day, you need someone who can legally sign a contract. So in addition to those other values, a few more around how the group worked and the structure and process. How did the group engage with governing bodies, and how did the group consider stakeholders outside of the defined geography that you mentioned?
Yeah, so engagement with governing bodies, there was a lot because it is such a small community. Everyone knows everyone. So there were frequent conversations that were happening between the Stewardship Council, for example, and the City Council and the mayor. There was coordination with a city-county planning board that was put together. So that was happening, and those folks were attending. Like, they would come to our meetings, we would go to their meetings. So there was no like sort of formal process necessarily, but there was a lot of coordination and collaboration. And then I keep blinking on the second part of your question, Sandy.
Oh, I think that got to a lot of it.
Okay.
One person was asking about folks from the state of Montana and other stakeholders and other issues that might be adjacent to that community in particular.
Yeah. So like I said, there was a concerted effort to get folks to the table that A, did not live in White Sulphur Springs, and B, were skeptical of the project. So that was reaching out to groups, for example, that had campaigned against the project and saying, do you want to either come to our meetings or even potentially have someone on this board and kind of weigh in? That was that was hit or miss in terms of success, especially why there were some lawsuits tied to the project. And so there was a real hesitancy why those were playing out to directly engage from some outside groups. But I mentioned White Sulphur is a small town. Montana's also a small state. And so we were able to kind of leverage the personal and professional networks of folks on the board to get outside voices and stakeholders to the table.
The next sort of bucket of questions is around how you get the developer to kind of play ball with you. So you talked a little bit about that social license or getting that local buy-in for the project. Some of the questions are around how did you get the mind to even engage in the conversation, to agree to a process, to pay for it? And what if you were facing a situation where it was an anonymous developer or somehow masked, which is the case in a lot of AI data center developments?
Man, the anonymous developer, that is very tricky. I don't have a great answer for that immediately. I'd have to chew on that one a little bit because that's hard, right? If you don't know who to talk to, then that's very, very difficult. I'd say if you do know the developer, if they have if they have a presence, even if that's not necessarily like an office front, if there's someone you can call, I would say oftentimes they are willing to engage. So in this case, the mine actually wanted to encourage this kind of process because they wanted to secure that social license, meaning that they wanted that buy-in. And again, this depends on the industry. It depends on the project specifically. But one thing that's important to remember is that oftentimes, so I mentioned leverage might be highest when they're trying to apply for land use permits or operating permits, that kind of thing. But they often do have to come back to the table, and they understand that. So they might need to come back to the table for expansions for the project or alterations. So I would say that oftentimes the developer is willing. I don't know if eager might be a little bit strong, but they're willing to engage in this, and they understand that if they can have something that structure in place, that can be beneficial to them and help maybe tamp down some pushback that they're seeing. So potentially it could be a win-win.
Jackson, do you have any insights into what might make a developer of any kind more likely to want that buy-in from the local community? Is there anything about the type of development that might make it more important for them to want that local support versus another kind of development that might not need as much local support?
Yeah, I think I have two thoughts on that front. I think one is lawsuits. So if developers are very they're wary and they see lawsuits as very costly and detrimental because they have this project life cycle and they have their ROI calculated and they have all these things, right, that are dependent on a fairly smooth process in terms of developing the project and getting it in operations. And if they see barriers, and one of those can be lawsuits that slow down the issuance of an operating permit or something like that, that really brings them to the table. They're like, okay, if we can come up with something that might help insulate us against some litigation, that would be very valuable for their bottom line. So that's one. I do think the jobs piece of it matters too, right? I mean, if they're going to try to be recruiting a lot of local folks to work, and that's project and industry specific, but if they need to tap into the local labor supply, then they need a group of folks that's willing to come work for them and support the project that way. So that also, I think, gets them motivated to negotiate or work with the community.
Yeah. I think you're going to have a lot to say on this. One of the questions was around the difference between CBPs, or community benefits plans, and CBAs, community benefits agreements, and what it looks like to include not just mitigation, like you mentioned, that good neighbor agreement model that you brought to the table, but to bring benefits that are beyond just mitigating harms of a project. Can you talk a little bit about those differences and how the Marr County Stewardship Council landed on what they did?
Yeah, so the community benefits plans, I mean, that terminology really started to gain traction tied to federal legislation and investment. So community benefits plans were a required component of applying for funding under some big federal bills like the Inflation Reduction Act. So that's where that, like, CBP, if you saw that acronym, that's kind of where that emerged. The community benefits plan was not legally binding. It was similar to like the framework that I mentioned in the initial framework in Marr County, right? Where it's like, okay, we have a plan to work with the community and to potentially support, or invest in these areas. The community benefits agreement, that's the legal contract. So that's the difference there. So you could think of it as like some community benefits plans would include a CBA and some wouldn't, right? But the best practice, like the Cadillac of these developer agreements and involvements, is the CBA. And the last part here, what was the second thing you mentioned, Annie?
The second part was around the moving from just mitigation to actual.
Oh, yeah. So I think that really just depends on the priorities, and that's why in Marr County we made an effort to ask folks what they saw in terms of opportunities, but challenges and risks. And it also depends heavily on the regulatory context, right? So in Montana, there's a unique set of state statutes and regulations around hard rock mining. So that's what I mentioned, like bringing in experts that can help a community understand, okay, like, what is the state requiring in terms of like water quality, right? Like, so they make the mine test once a month and they're looking for these pollutants, and what happens if there's something that's out of line, like what's that process? So if the community understands that, then they can identify potential gaps or areas where they feel like there needs to be something like a third-party consultant that comes in and helps provide data or does presentations. But yeah, just I think gaps where they might not feel like the regulation, the current, regulatory space is adequate. Ideally you want those long-term, it's called a community benefits agreement, right? So it's not called a community protection agreement, but those are two, I like to use that coin kind of analogy, right? It's two sides of the same coin. If you don't protect the local waterways and local environment, well, that's going to have impacts in terms of your long-term economic future and potential too. So, I think it's place specific, but.
This next question gets into sort of the specific thing that the community might want to try to protect or get benefits for in some kind of agreement. The question is around sort of the risk management and the potential to overbuild infrastructure for a temporary development and the needs of the community for that development. So you talked about the potential for the copper mine to be temporary in nature. And this person's asking about, you might build up more schools, more roads, more sewer system infrastructure to support the increased population, but then maybe that population goes back down after the peak of that development's use, and then the community has these increased costs. I think this is really transferable to the risk management for AI data centers, where there's an anticipation of how much electric need there might be to support a data center, but that's pretty speculative, and folks are not sure if that building is really going to get used, but the costs of building it are really high. So I don't know what comments you might have about that in this particular community and the transferability of the lessons you learned to other contexts.
Yeah, there's a lot of work that has been done, and there's a lot in the literature on this front, right? It's not just you might overbuild your housing, but even I was working in a mining community actually in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that had the mine build this really big road that increased all this recreation access, and then the mine closed and they couldn't afford to maintain the road after the mine closed, right? They didn't have the property tax base to ensure that they could keep the road maintenance budget or increase it enough. So I think that it's understanding the context, the geographic, the socioeconomic context of the place, and having a vision for the other side of that project, and understanding that data centers might fall into this bucket too. Mines close, right? These things like the supply and demand forecasting that's happening. Annie, you mentioned it's very speculative. Like, things change, right? So having backup plans and contingencies for, okay, what if we don't have this, this developer in town? Like, what happens if our property tax base decreases? I think, so having a plan for a rainy day is important.
We are right at time. Jackson, thank you so much for being here and being willing to share the details of the Marr County example. I think that getting into the weeds is really, really helpful for many people in the audience, as you can tell from the many great questions. Do you have any final words for the audience before we wrap up?
No, thank you for all the great questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get through more of them. Like I said, I have some links, so I'll ask Tanum and the Rural Assembly team to pass some resources along, and then I'm happy to, if folks want to connect individually, I'm happy to set up a call or bounce emails back and forth. If you had a burning question, I'm happy to answer it in another format. So.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us. Thanks Jackson, Annie, thanks Lillian and Juliana of the Radically Rural team for getting all the questions together on the back end. Really, really glad. And thank you to everyone who participated in the chat, sharing additional resources, perspective, alongside your questions. There's a lot of community knowledge to go off of, and this is just a starting point. So thank you everybody for being here today, and give us a shout at the Rural Assembly team if you need anything, and we will hopefully see you at Rural Assembly Everywhere on July 23rd or elsewhere. And yes, we will be sending out the additional resources mentioned throughout the session over email. We will get that out probably by the end of the week. We need a little turnaround time to get it all together. So thanks for understanding. And we hope to see you soon. Thanks, everybody. Hope you have a good day.